I don't often have the opportunity to speak to people who are in the positions that many of you are in, from the little that I understand. Usually I'm in the NGO world. I am in the world of people who are basically quite opposed to many of the European policies. So this is where I am coming from. I should say also that I was born in the United States. I've spent the first 20 years of my life there. I studied in France, I married, I became a French citizen, and I am a fervent European. I think that Europe is the fountain of the Enlightenment, and I think the Enlightenment is one of the greatest human achievements in the entire history of the world. And this is what I am fighting for, because I believe profoundly that the whole Enlightenment inheritance, that heritage, is being little by little destroyed, perhaps not entirely yet, but that is the path that I think we are on. And this is extremely distressing to me, not just because I was for a couple of decades a fervent American who believed in the United States, at least until the Vietnam War, which was my political changing point, and when I began to understand what was actually going on. But in Europe, I have always found that this was a continent which had invented something which could be a beacon to the rest of the world, which could be a model for the rest of the world. And I think it is irresponsible and regressive to be harming this model, which is what I think is happening now. So this is a very brief preface, because I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to say to anyone that you're in the wrong job. I would like to debate with you. I am very interested to know what you think, but I can tell you that more and more, and ever since 2005, when the referenda against the on the Constitution were held in France and in Holland, and that's where I want to start, there has been a greater and greater sense among the sorts of Europeans that I meet, and I meet people from trade unions, I meet people from the NGO world, and a lot of very ordinary citizens, because I speak a lot in public as the honorary president of ATTAC, which is now Europe-wide. It started 15 years ago, and it's called the, I don't know how much you had on your invitation, or your, so I'm telling you this again, the Association pour la taxe sur les transactions financières pour aider les citoyens. By the way, anyone who would feel more comfortable discussing in French, I'm perfectly happy to take any questions or comments in French later on. And also as the board chair of the Transnational Institute, which will celebrate its 40th anniversary next year, we have always been on the progressive side. We have tried to introduce ideas before other people got a hold of them, and to say this is what we ought to be discussing now, both between North and South, the relations between North and South, but also vis-a-vis of power in general. And we now have a great many programs running which are, I think, bringing new values to the fore. Our Drugs and Democracy program is largely responsible for what Uruguay has just done in authorizing cannabis. And, but we are listened to by the United Nations on that score and on some others. Anyway, that's my own introduction to what I would like to say. I would like to start, as I said, with 2005. One could go back further into the drafting of the initial treaties in Europe, and I suppose your invitation said that this would be about Europe. It's not about the world. In 2005, I think people who weren't in France do not necessarily understand what happened during that debate. We went into a situation where in January, the votes were going to be, the opinion polls said 30% 30% no, 70% yes for Europe. Several organizations came together in coalitions. There were 900 to 1,000 different coalitions in France, bringing together people where often ATTAC was the broker because we weren't in competition with anybody else. So there were trade unions, there were political parties, there were independent people, and this is the biggest debate that had happened in France since 1968. This was a debate in which the Constitution, the text of the Constitutional Treaty, became the #1 bestseller, if you can imagine. This turgid, terrible, unreadable text became the top. The French National Publishing House had never had a success like that. L'Humanité sent out a copy of the Constitution in a sort of newspaper to every citizen in France. This was a debate in which, in my own family, I have a son who was for and a daughter-in-law who was against, and this was a fight over the dinner table. It was not, as many people who were not in France were told afterwards or during, that this was not a vote on the right. It is true that the right, the far right, was in particular concerned about Turkey. That was the only issue they discussed. They tried to bring us onto that terrain. We did not accept that, and after 3 weeks that debate was dead. And when the vote took place, it was 55% no and 45% yes. Now, this was a class vote. In Neuilly, where Nicolas Sarkozy had been the mayor, this is perhaps the richest suburb in France, it was 80% for the yes, 20% for the no. In a working class suburb of Rouen, it was the exact opposite. It was 20% for the yes, 80% for the no. Now, why did this happen? It happened because people read the treaty, they discussed it, they debated it, and they saw that this had nothing to do with the democratic future that they wanted for Europe. Now, what happened after that? Well, 2 days later, the Dutch voted even more in favor of the no, 60% or something. Oh, and I forgot to say that the participation was something that a European election had never seen before. It was 71%, whereas usually in a European election it's 40, 45 at the best. But this was considered as a national opportunity to say what we thought about Europe and what sort of Europe we wanted. So this was not a right-wing vote. This was not a vote which was in a certain sector. Even our worst enemies, although the entire media were against us, only not even our worst enemies said that more than 17% of the no votes came from the right. So this was a significant issue in France. So what happened? Well, the Commission went about immediately putting together a secret team. Nobody knew exactly who was in it. And they wrote the Lisbon Treaty, which, as not I am saying, but as Giscard d'Estaing said, is a treaty which copies exactly what was in the TCE and the Treaty for une Constitution Européenne. And as Giscard d'Estaing said, they have sugared it. How shall I? Let me see if I can remember in French, because you all speak French, I'm sure. They have made it. They have taken off the rough edges to make it more palatable, to make it easier to swallow. That was it, pour le rendre plus facile à avaler. Angela Merkel said, don't worry, it's exactly the same thing as the Constitution. They took out the Beethoven, they took out the flag, they took out a few things like that, but it is exactly the same thing. So that showed us what Europe thought about democracy. I know they were shocked. I know they didn't believe what had happened to them. They didn't believe that any major country like France could say no, but that is what we did, and we discovered that it didn't make, frankly, a damn bit of difference. So, ever since then, we have been watching what has happened, and what we have seen is that the present Commission, and I have to say I focus particularly on the Commission, although I know that the Council very often uses the Commission as a screen so they can push through things which they could not push through otherwise if they had to say things directly to their own citizens. But we know our governments will never give us another referendum, except in Ireland, where, by the way, as you will recall, the Irish also said no to the Lisbon Treaty, but they were the only ones who were allowed to vote. We will never have another opportunity to vote on a European treaty. These things will go through like a letter in the post office, and we won't be asked our opinions. Besides, they go through too fast without debate. Even our MPs are very often in the dark about exactly what is going on. There have been several things that have passed that way. Recently, there is the six-pack, there is the European Treaty on Stability and Governance. There have been various measures, but all of which have been to take more power into the Commission and to leave less for the national governments, including the budgets, which are now entirely in the hands. It's Europe, it's the Commission that sees the budgets first, and then they are sent with recommendations. This is the European semester idea. They are sent with recommendations and with the provision, if they're not listened to, then there will be sanctions, there can be sanctions that are applied. Now, the Commission is totally won over to the idea of austerity. I have to say that austerity has no intellectual foundations whatsoever now. Everything that they were grasping at, as grasping at straws, has been intellectually destroyed. There was one paper that was used a lot in arguments at the level of economists and policymakers, which was by two economists at the Bocconi Institute in Milan, which is the most prestigious business school in Milano. And these two Italian authors, Alesina and Ardagna, wrote a paper in which they said, cut, 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 make austerity work, and you will see that foreign investment will come flooding into your country, because they will say they are taking austerity policies seriously, they are serious, and therefore they can be trusted and we can invest there. This has absolutely not happened. Austerity has caused the scale of investment to drop. Last year, I think, I forget exactly the figures, but it was the lowest year in several. The paper by Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt, I'm sure I can see a lady nodding her head, many others are nodding their heads. For those who do not know what happened, this was an extremely influential paper by the author, by the person, Kenneth Rogoff, who had been the chief economist of the IMF. And with Carmen Reinhardt at Harvard, they wrote a paper which was really grabbed by the neoliberals to say, look, you see, if you get to 90% debt, then your economy is going to spiral down, and if you don't make cuts, well, too bad for you, because you will see your entire country is going to go down the drain little by little. Last April, a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts in the United States was asked by his professors to go over this paper, to report upon it. It was a kind of coursework for him to do this. And he tried to reproduce the results that Reinhardt and Rogoff had come to. And he couldn't manage to do it. So he showed some of his friends, also postdoc fellows, and they tried to do it and they couldn't either. So then the professor said, well, go to the source. So they wrote to the authors, and eventually, not right away, but eventually they got a sort of avowal, yes. We seem to have misplaced a couple of commas or a couple of zeros or in the Excel tables. And once those were put right, then they went over all the figures again and they saw that the thing was riddled with errors. So this has collapsed. It was very embarrassing. I'm sorry for Reinhardt and Rogoff, but if you can't get your Excel tables right, and you're an economist, which I'm not, by the way, then you better just say, you know, sorry, we made a very big mistake and we're sorry. And then say what the consequences of that mistake are. They've said they're sorry, but they haven't said what the consequences of that mistake are, because these consequences have been very serious. Mrs. Merkel has been extraordinarily, she was one of the people who grasped that paper as a good argument in favor of reducing the debts and accessorily reducing the levels of budget deficits. Now, I don't know what, maybe some of you know where these magic figures came from. Budget deficits of 3%, debt levels, limits of 60%. Where did this come from? Maybe there's some civil servants who worked at the time of Maastricht who know where this came from. But why not 4%? Why not 65%? Nobody knows. Germany was beyond 60% in 2006. But many countries had gone beyond that. But if the 90% figure doesn't hold anymore, why do we have to take these magic figures, these sort of tutelary figures, as something real that we have to obey? But everything is constructed around this, and now we have the structural budget deficit, which cannot go beyond 0.5%, and nobody knows exactly how that's calculated, but this is going to be used for permanent austerity. The third intellectual crumbling beyond the Italian paper and the Rogoff-Reinhardt paper is work done by the IMF, which has been, and I have to say this in their favor, because I haven't said much in my life that was favorable to the IMF, but here I have to say they have done something really good. They have said we were wrong. They have said in 3 separate studies that Greece should not have been attacked the way it was, that they were wrong to do it that way. They say this was a marathon and not a sprint, and we tried to treat it as a sprint. But this should be a very long process, and of course, since Greece's GDP has gone down by more than 25%, and by 2016 it's expected to go down a further 10%, whereas the entire European Union GDP is expected to shrink by 3.5%. I'm sorry, but you know, I mean, you cannot talk about growth in this context. The IMF has also said that, and this was an official paper, it was written by the head of the chief economist of the IMF, Olivier Blanchard. And there, he and his colleagues wrote that the multiple that they had used to count the cost of reducing government spending, they said when they published the paper, they thought, I'll give you an example, that if you cut by €1, it would cost you 50 centimes. They later said, we're sorry, we were in error by a factor of 2 or 3. In other words, it could cost you twice or 3 times as much as that. The other thing is that they've now published not a policy paper, but another working paper in which 5 IMF economists say that austerity has been shown in every instance where it has been used in Europe up to now, that there are major effects. One is longer-term unemployment. People stay unemployed longer than they did without those policies. The second is it creates greater inequality. And the third is that it lowers labor's share in the GDP of a country, in the value added of a given country's economy every year. You know, I'm sure all of you, that the value added is divided into the part that goes to capital and the part that goes to labor. It used to be, in the 1970s, that in the European Union, labor was getting approximately 70%, that's an average, and capital was getting 30%. It is now at least 60% for labor, but capital has gained a 10% portion of GDP, and so it's 60-40. In France, it's now 56-44, still in favor of labor. But everyone talks about the cost of labor. Nobody talks about the cost of capital. And the major investors now are demanding 10, 12, sometimes more percent return on their capital, whereas investors in capitalist countries used to be happy with 2, 3, 4% a year. This is no longer the case. But I would like to hear sometimes an official pronouncement about the cost of capital, and not always hear that labor is too expensive. Now, what else can I tell you? I think that the fact that the IMF has disavowed its own work, I don't know why they are still in the Troika. I wonder if they are staying there because they think perhaps they can change the attitude of the EU Commission, or whether they can change the attitude of the European Central Bank. I don't know. But what I do know is the suffering of the Greek, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Irish people, and which is beginning to spread like a cancer throughout Europe. I know that these policies are killing people. I know that people are not getting proper treatment in Greek hospitals because there is no medicine. I know that every time austerity, anytime inequalities are increased, which is the case in all of these countries, women suffer more, and they suffer first. There's more wife beating, there's more homicides, there's more suicides, there's more mental and physical illness. That is what austerity is doing to Europe. And meanwhile, it is destroying the social policies which were hard fought, but after the Second World War, labor won a lot of victories over the decades. But this is being clawed back. Now, I spoke about, in technical terms, about the share of GDP between capital and labor. But if you give labor 10% less GDP as a share, which is the case now compared to 20, 30 years ago, what does that mean? Well, the gross national product of Europe is about 13 trillion, so that means that every year there's 1.3 trillion that is not going into the pockets of working people, that is therefore not being spent, because as you know, most working people spend their salaries on goods and services. They don't put it away. If that 1.3 trillion goes to capital instead of to labor, where is it going to go? It will go to financial markets, which is what it is doing, has been doing for the last several years. Now, I'd also like to speak, I have 5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to devote those 5 minutes to the Transatlantic Treaty on Trade and Investment, Transatlantic Partnership, on Trade and Investment, the TTIP. Now, this is an invention between the United States and Europe, which has been cooked up for the last 20 years nearly in an ad hoc organization called the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, which is bringing together and has brought together transnational corporations from both sides of the Atlantic. They have been working in smaller groups on every sector. What are the regulations you want to bring down? They've come to a conclusion, and now it's time to launch the TTIP, which is not very much about trade. Trade represents a very small part of the agenda. Well, I can't tell you exactly how much because the texts are secret, which is typical of the EU. But the text being secret, from what we know, when it says on trade and investment, it's not very much about trade, because the only areas where trade is really important as to tariffs are agriculture, mostly processed food, and the automotive industry, where the tariffs are still a little bit higher than elsewhere. Otherwise, they're between 2 and 3% on average. So it's not so much about trade. It's not so much about investment, because there's 3 trillion invested on both sides. There haven't been too many problems so far. What it is about is bringing down regulations, and what it is about in particular is giving investors inordinate rights, and to use the clause that has been put into so many bilateral treaties, which is called the Investor to State Dispute Resolution System. ISDS, it's a system which allows a transnational corporation which has invested to sue a government. Now, it's not as if European courts or the American courts were some sort of banana republic courts. That's not what we're talking about. There are some reasons to say, okay, in a bilateral treaty, I understand this. But between the US and Europe, the national court system is pretty solid, and it is pretty sure. And they are making a parallel judicial system with arbitrators, with lawyers who are specialized. They cost $1,000 an hour. The arbitrators are very expensive in this parallel system, where there are now over 560 cases being tried, which are about bilateral investments treaties. At least a third of the cases involve demands for compensation of over $100 million. I just saw one day before yesterday in which a mining company is demanding $1 billion from Costa Rica because they won't let them mine for gold and ruin the entire ecosystem of one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. We are opening up, not as I say, but as the lawyers say, a bonanza of litigation. And if this treaty goes through, you are going to see so many investors suing sovereign governments that it is going to be a blizzard of lawsuits, and in which you, I, and other European citizens will be paying. Because if these companies get awards, then it's the taxpayers who pay. It's not in the national budget. Now, this is one I think that we, and when I say we, I hope it means some of you, but it also means the NGO world that I am involved in. I think we might be able to win this one, because we know that their aim is to reduce regulations. The Transatlantic Business Dialogue is now the Transatlantic Business Council. There's also something called the Transatlantic Economic Council. And these are transnationals who are there and who say very proudly, you can look it up on the web, we are making policy. It's the first time that they've really come out and said, it's us, baby. They said it in Rio. They said it in Rio for the environment. But they hadn't had the chutzpah to say, we are the ones now making policy. But they are, it's true. And I think we have a chance to win this one, even though it's now the EU that negotiates for everybody, and our individual countries aren't in the negotiations per se. But we can win because why? Because the people who are against GMOs, genetically modified organisms, are shocked that there will be lawsuits clearly to force Europe to accept GMOs. The health system, people are angry because they know that the US is going to try to reduce the use of generic drugs in Europe, and therefore make people's health care far more expensive than it is now. There are people who will be simply shocked by the legal implications of this. That was true in 1997-98 when we won against the multilateral agreement on investment that some of you will remember. There are going to be a lot of constituencies that are going to be up in arms about the TTIP, and I say more power to them, and I will be back in Belgium after a brief hiatus over the weekend to work with the Alter Summit, which is a group of 200 organizations from all over Europe, because we have seen that you can put 1/10 of the Portuguese population into the street and nothing happens. You can have 3 general strikes in Spain and nothing happens. You can have protests all over the place and nobody in Brussels pays the slightest attention. And therefore, it's embryonic for the moment, but we are trying to construct a movement where there are already 200 organizations, trade unions, social movements, ecologists, feminists, activists from all kinds of areas who are coming together and working on the same issues in their own countries, so that we can speak not just as French, Germans, etc., but as Europeans, all of us, and say enough is enough, and we want a different Europe. We are fervent Europeans, but we want a different Europe. Thank you.